All right, well, why don't we get started? We have some suspicion that Metro is hurting us this morning in terms of attendance, but I know we've got some people online. I wanted just to thank everyone for coming out, first off, and to give a special thanks to ORF, the Observer Research Foundation, for partnering with us on this particular program. But we've done a great deal of work over the years with ORF. We count them, Sanjoy Joshi, who's here, and Samir Saran as good friends and partners. And we'll hear a little bit from Sanjoy later about some of the things on his mind on this issue of U.S. India defense relationship. You know, I think like so many issues at stake in the U.S. India relationship, we swing between unmerited optimism and unwarranted pessimism. We're not often in the middle, and I have to confess, I myself have fallen into one of those two over the years. I think the best answer to dealing with those swings is developing a better understanding of the constraints in the relationship and what the real opportunities are. It's sort of a challenge. It's a challenge to strike that balance, because you want to be realistic on the one hand, but if you're not dreaming a little bit, we have no prospect of going anywhere with the relationship. So there's always that tension, I think, in U.S.-India relations on the defense side, but in many other areas. And I think it's something that we're hopefully working through in a very, in the end, productive way. To help us strike the balance today in this regard, gives me great pleasure to welcome Dr. Amy Searight to Heritage Foundation. She's Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for South and Southeast Asia, and she's just back from a trip to India with Secretary of Defense, so she's fresh and I think maybe on the optimistic side right now. I hope so. And so we look forward to hearing her remarks. You know, at DOD, Amy serves as principal advisor to senior leadership within Department of Defense for all matters pertaining to U.S. interests in South Asia and Southeast Asia within the department. She joined the Office of Secretary of Defense in October 2012 as the principal director for East Asia, and prior to that, she served as senior policy advisor on Asia at USAID. Amy has been an academic, and in a previous administration, a Republican one, 2003 to 2004, she served as a CFR fellow on the policy planning staff at the State Department. Amy's PhD is in political science from Stanford University, which is probably the connection we know each other from, mutual friends, et cetera. So with that, let me invite you up and you kick us off, and we'll get the program started.
Thank you, Walter, for that nice introduction. And I want to thank the Heritage Foundation for inviting me here today and for hosting this really great event. At the Department of Defense, we rely heavily on analysis and insights to help shape our thinking and our policies because we know that the team here helps bring great expertise to issues across Asia. So thank you for that. The U.S.-India defense partnership is multifaceted, and it's a global partnership rooted in shared values, mutual interests, and common goals, from combating terrorism to protecting freedom of navigation to maintaining regional peace and security. And this includes, and increasingly is focused on, Asia, where, as Secretary Carter stated in a speech at the Council on Foreign Relations last month, our two countries are engaged in a strategic handshake with India reaching east through its Act East policy, and the United States reaching west across the Pacific with its rebalance. This convergence of interests in Asia, paired with recent developments in bilateral defense ties, has built tremendous momentum over the last few years and enabled us to start to make real substantive progress in our cooperation. So yes, Walter, I am in the optimist camp at the moment. And now as we look ahead into the fall, the remaining months of the administration, we're finding ways to try to lock in our achievements and cement defense ties to ensure that the progress we've made is enduring and set us on a path to achieving the President's vision for a bilateral relationship that is truly one of the defining strategic partnerships of the 21st century. Since Secretary Carter and Minister Parrikar signed our 10-year defense framework agreement last June, we've accomplished much in our efforts to deepen defense and security relations. Forging a defense industrial partnership is a key aspect of this relationship, and the Defense Technology and Trade Initiative, or DTTI, has resulted in closer communications between our defense technology communities and has expanded cooperation on co-production and co-development and on science and technology, and opened the aperture for advanced technology cooperation through our jet engine and aircraft carrier technology working groups. A second area of progress is in our mill-to-mill engagement, which is reaching a new high water mark. Japan will again join the Naval Exercise Malabar this year, which will be the third consecutive year in a row. And Japan is now a permanent member of Malabar, which we're very happy about. And India will participate in RIMPAC again this summer and is seeking full participation status in Cobra Gold starting next year. The Indian Air Force joined Red Flag last month for the first time since 2008, and our Special Forces restarted their bilateral exercise Vajra Prahar after a 4-year hiatus. We've also seen an unprecedented level of senior civilian officials' engagement, which has resulted in a rigorous and sometimes grueling travel schedule for many of our principals on both sides, but it has enabled us to deepen our dialogue on India on a range of issues and help advance our partnership and really build up a relationship of trust and better communication and transparency. So one such example is Secretary Carter, who, as Walter mentioned, he traveled to Goa and Delhi last month in April, and I was with him for that visit. This was his fourth meeting with Minister Parrikar in less than a year, and the Secretary, it's I think important to note, the Secretary has spent more time with Minister Parrikar than any other foreign counterpart this year. So this is indicative not only of the pace of engagement, but also what we can accomplish. So among many things that we were able to announce when we were in Delhi were 2 new DTTI co-production development projects, one on digital helmet-mounted displays and another one on joint biological tactical detection systems. We also finalized 4 science and technology government-to-government project agreements worth about $43 million. Under DTTI, the aircraft carrier and jet engine working groups have been making steady progress in expanding technological cooperation, and we're deepening our consultation on aircraft carrier design and operations in the aircraft carrier working group. In support of Prime Minister Modi's Make in India campaign, we've also shared 2 proposals to bolster India's suite of fighter aircraft for the Government of India's consideration. We're also making progress on implementing the U.S. India Joint Strategic Vision for the Asia-Pacific and Indian Ocean region. There are a lot of maritime security objectives that are contained in that vision, and to try to achieve them, we are launching next week a Maritime Security Dialogue that will help shepherd cooperation on this front, and it will be led by Assistant Secretary of Defense Dave Scheer, my boss, as well as the State Department, and Navy colleagues will also join that dialogue. In this context, we're also we have reaffirmed our desire to expeditiously conclude a white shipping technical arrangement to improve data sharing on commercial shipping traffic, and we've also agreed to commence Navy-to-Navy discussions on submarine safety and anti-submarine warfare. Another significant step that we announced in Delhi is in the area of defense facilitating agreements, what we used to call foundational agreements, but we are now calling facilitating agreements. We agreed in principle to conclude a logistics agreement that is currently called the Logistics Exchange Memorandum of Agreement, or LAMOA. And we agreed to continue working towards facilitating agreements in other areas because all of these help to enhance military cooperation and technology transfer. So we're optimistic that we can get the LAMOA across the finish line soon, but we're hoping to see progress on both the Basic Exchange and Cooperation Agreement, or BECA, which will enable us to share geospatial information, and the Communications Capability and Security Agreement, or COMCASA, which is the newly renamed SISMOA, which will enable us to better share technology. We also welcome plans across our services for greater complexity in military engagements and exercises, including agreement to develop plans for more advanced maritime exercises. And while in Goa, Secretary Carter also had the chance to visit the Indian naval base Kadamba in Karwar, and the INS Vikramaditya, I can't say it, Vikramaditya, the new aircraft carrier with the ski jump. This marked the first time that a U.S. Defense Secretary had visited the carrier, and it was the first time that any U.S. senior official, had visited the Karwar Naval Base. So the overarching theme that runs through all of these accomplishments is that the U.S. and India both support a rules-based order and a regional security architecture conducive to peace and prosperity in the Asia-Pacific and Indian Ocean. And we pledge to work together and work with other nations to ensure the security and stability that have been beneficial to the Asia-Pacific for 7 decades. I want to emphasize, of course, that this is not just the Defense Department. The administration as a whole is committed to elevating high-level engagement and continuing that pace of high-level engagement through the end of the term in order to better chart the future trajectory of the relationship. But the defense relationship really is a particular bright spot in an overall very rapidly improving bilateral relationship. Even with these accomplishments and the clear desire on both sides to deepen the relationship, however, challenges do remain. And part of this is because we are both complex bureaucracies made up of complicated systems, which sometimes makes it difficult to take the strategic vision of what we want the relationship to be and convert it into tangible cooperation and action. And DTTI is an example of this. Although the initiative clearly dovetails well with Prime Minister Modi's Make in India campaign, and we have seen a substantial upswing in dialogue and cooperation on this front, there still is sort of an issue of expectations and expectations management. I mean, DTTI is uniquely designed for India, and through DTTI, we treat India as a special partner in a way that we treat no other partner or even ally. But DTTI does not eliminate export control requirements on some of the most advanced U.S. technologies. There are many technologies that we don't transfer even to our closest treaty allies that have deployed with the United States in operations around the globe. So there are still going to be limitations in what we can do with India, as there are limitations across the board with all of our allies and partners. And this is something where we need to continue to have a conversation with India about this. Our military-to-military ties are also sometimes affected by some of these constraints. Although both sides recognize the value of military ties, these exchanges and exercises sometimes do not keep pace with the rate of our political engagement. So capacity constraints and other limitations continue to limit what we can do in terms of operational cooperation. But despite these obstacles, officials and militaries on both sides are driving toward an ever more mature defense partnership, one which will benefit not only each other, but the region as a whole. We're having more and more discussions in areas like strategy, how we develop strategy, net assessments, and in areas like maritime security, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, and other mission sets. All of this is underpinned by a shared vision for the relationship, one which is, as I mentioned before, rooted in shared values, mutual interests, and common goals. For Asia, this manifests as the President and Prime Minister's joint strategic vision for the Asia-Pacific and Indian Ocean region, which I mentioned before. This came out of President Obama's historic January 2015 trip to India for Republic Day. This was the first time our leaders have publicly issued a shared vision for the future of the Indo-Pacific region and our roles in achieving and sustaining that vision. So today we're undertaking a broad range of efforts to implement the joint strategic vision, and we are doing so in ways that were unthinkable only 2 or 3 years ago. So as one example, Defense Minister Parrikar attended the ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting Plus, or ADMM Plus, last November in Malaysia. And his participation was very welcome. His voice was very present and articulate on the kinds of shared values that are expressed in the Joint Strategic Vision. And so he made a very positive difference. We also expect to see Minister Parrikar at the Shangri-La Dialogue this June. India's Ministry of Defense has not always been so engaged in defense diplomacy at such high levels in these regional fora. So we welcome their enhanced participation. And it's a sign that both the United States and India recognize ASEAN centrality and the importance of ASEAN in the regional security architecture. Conversations between our navies on submarine safety and anti-submarine warfare used to be a very sensitive issue. But following the Secretary's trip, our navies now have high-level support to pursue these discussions. On maritime security and maritime domain awareness, for years we've recognized that this is an area of mutual interest and a window of opportunity for practical engagement. And now we're seeing the potential for cooperation really come to fruition, as demonstrated by our finalizing the White Shipping Agreement and convening our inaugural Maritime Security Dialogue. We're optimistic about what we can achieve in this area now that we're beginning to really get the right people to the table to have real substantive and action-oriented discussions. We also expect the DTTI cooperation on aircraft carriers through the Joint Working Group on Aircraft Carrier Technology Cooperation will present new opportunities for us to collaborate in this area and contribute to regional maritime security. And let me finally mention humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. This is another important area where we are increasing our cooperation. As you all know, the Indo-Pacific is highly prone to large-scale natural disasters, and effective cooperation between partners when a disaster strikes can save many lives, as we saw in the tragic earthquake in Nepal last year, where the U.S. and India both responded and were able to coordinate pretty effectively on the ground. In addition to the work our State Department and USAID colleagues are already pursuing, the Pacific Command Center for Excellence in Disaster Management and Humanitarian Assistance has relaunched its disaster response working group with India's integrated defense staff to discuss cooperation and best practices. So today, regional and global events pull America and India together as never before. Our perceptions of security challenges are converging, and on the most important issues of the day, our interests are increasingly overlap. We've laid the foundation for a true strategic partnership with India. With this foundation set, we want to build on this progress to sustain the relationship in the long term. Over the coming months, we're enhancing America's force posture throughout the Asia-Pacific region, operationalizing the next phase of the rebalance and cementing it for the long term. And the U.S. India strategic partnership is a very big part of this. It's an increasingly important part of our rebalance strategy. As the U.S. stretches west in our rebalance and India reaches east, the U.S. and India will continue to collaborate, and our militaries will find ways to complement one another. And together, we will forge a relationship that benefits global peace and security and build a bright future for both of our nations in this very consequential part of the world. Thank you. I'm happy to take some questions.
So I'll help a little bit with the questions. I want to open it up, but while you all think about it maybe a little bit, I'll start out with an easy one. Could you comment on the communique that the foreign ministers issued, the Russian, Indian, and Chinese last month concerning the South China Sea, that from an American perspective, a Washington perspective, the language looked remarkably like the Chinese position on South China Sea? And how do you understand it? Where do you think it's headed? Have you had any subsequent conversations with the Indians about it?
I'm not sure that's an easy question, Walter. So right after Secretary Carter visited Delhi, Minister Parrikar the next week, and National Security Advisor Doval, and Foreign Minister of External Affairs Swaraj, they all traveled to Beijing, and one of the meetings was this trilateral meeting that Swaraj had with Russian and China counterparts, out of which came this joint communique. I also will note that I actually had stayed behind in the region and traveled to, I was in Cambodia when Wang Yi was there at the same time, and then we both were on the plane together to Laos. And out of that, in Laos, he unilaterally announced that China had reached an agreement with Brunei, Cambodia, and Laos on resolving maritime disputes bilaterally. Subsequently, Cambodia publicly said that they had reached no such agreement, no consensus with China, and Brunei quietly said that there had been no agreement reached. But the communique, after we actually talked about this last week at the roundtable that I gave in the readout of the trip, and I meant, based on your comments, to go back and read the language, which I failed to do, because what the Indians have told us is that, from their perspective, they were able to really shape the language in a way that's not problematic. But I really should go back and read the language before I comment too much on it. But they're saying that they did not accept Chinese language about third-party intervention, for example, or third parties staying out, and that they insisted on having UNCLOS be referenced and peaceful dispute resolution. So I think I want to go back and read the language and kind of see where it falls out. But certainly from the Indian perspective, I don't think they meant to sign up for anything. And I brought up the other example of China really putting forth a narrative that countries in the region are coming to a consensus with China, because I think there's a very strong effort right now on the behalf of China to try to shape seemingly a regional consensus or a consensus among some, that there's some support for their position. And I think they're kind of doing a full court press, and they very successfully messaged that joint communique, but I'm not sure that it was an accurate kind of messaging. So,
good, thank you. Questions? Yeah, right here.
Thank you. I'm Alan Cronstedt from the Congressional Research Service. Just related to that question you were discussing. I understand that the Pentagon names India among countries that have a divergent reading of the UNCLOS, I guess, with regard to military operations within EEZs, and that India, unlike the United States, believes it's permissible for a country to exclude foreign nations from military operations within an EEZ, which is different from the U.S. government. Has that come up in your discussions, and does that complicate U.S. engagement with India on maritime security?
it has not come up. It is not complicated, to my knowledge, any activities or discussions that we've wanted to have. So that's interesting. I'll take a look at that. There are a number of countries, as you probably are well aware, who have taken a position on the EEZs that they should be notified if there's any military transit or activities, which we, of course, the United States does not accept. Malaysia is the one that's been sort of most active on that front recently in terms of trying to make that case, which has complicated some ASEAN, some ADMM plus activities. So it is something that's on our radar screen very much, and we do want to elevate that issue and try to work with some countries in the Asia Pacific, because we do see this as really problematic and complicating for the kinds of activities we want to do and the kind of narrative we want to uphold about freedom of navigation and working jointly together on a range of things. So I know there's a long list. I mean, I think Japan is on that list. There are a number of countries that take that position that we disagree with, and I think we do want to work with them collectively to try to find ways to, work through it in a way that's not going to complicate our activities. But India has not been. It has not come up in anything I've been engaged in.
Okay, thank you. Let me ask you about the Malabar exercises. Mm-hmm. I guess part of the news coming out that was not only Japan's involvement, but was the Australian opt-out, I guess. I mean, where do you think the Australians are generally at this point in the quadrilateral cooperation or broader?
No, I think Australia is very eager to be more engaged with India, including with our trilateral activities such as Malabar. They've been very consistent. I also have Australia in my portfolio, so this is something we talk about a lot. They've also been on they've been doing a lot of travel and high level engagement with the Indians, and are really trying to push forward on their defense relationship. And I think it's going well. As many of you probably know, there's a new trilateral dialogue between India, Australia, and Japan, which I think just convened for the first time this year. We very much support that. But on Malabar, the Indians have not been interested in inviting Australia in the recent iterations of Malabar. I think I don't want to speak for them, but I think, adding Japan in is a big win for all of us, and it allows us to do a lot more complex and interesting kinds of activities within Malabar. But we have not yet decided, India has not yet decided that they're interested in including Australia. That doesn't preclude doing other kinds of things with Australia. But I think you're really alluding to the Quad, the capital Q Quad question, which, I don't think there's been, despite, I believe, there have been sort of proposals out there to reinstitute the Quad that briefly met at the deputy foreign minister level in 2007. So that idea has been floating around. We're not pushing that particularly. I mean, it's not that, I think there could be value to that at some point. But I think right now what we find, at least speaking for the Department of Defense, what we find is that where we are really making gains is by having more trilateral and multilateral exercises. And so expanding some of our activities to be quadrilateral, I think, has a lot of benefit. And doing multiple trilateral exercises where there's a lot of overlap also has a lot of benefit. We're doing a lot more with Japan, Australia, the United States, for example, a lot of trilateral exercises. And now we're doing Malabar with Japan and India. So I think we're headed in that direction. I just think we can be low-key about it. This is my personal view, that, I think we should focus more on doing overlapping trilateral activities and work up to quadrilateral activities, and get away from an obsession with launching a big capital Q Quad, because I do think it makes some people nervous. And there's something about triangles that is very comforting to people. Like, you can have a triangle and no one feels particularly left out or ganged up upon, which is why we have so many. And we have a growing number of trilaterals, and I would like to launch more personally. But I think, we should think of a exercise and activity geography full of triangles and overlapping triangles rather than like fixating on a quad. My personal view.
Well, there's a lot we can do at a sort of a track 2 level on the Quad.
That's
that
right.
helps coordinate some of those interests. Yep. I'm going to take your question too, but let me ask you, just since you mentioned Australia, what did you make of their decision on the submarines?
I'm on the record, right?
Yeah.
So we, the United States has been very clear that it's Australia's decision to make, and we will support whatever platform they choose and try to work with them to develop an integrated platform. We still see huge strategic value in Australia, Japan, United States trilateral cooperation. It's become a real priority for us. And we see huge value in the bilateral defense relationship that's growing between Japan and Australia. So we certainly hope that will continue. We're very supportive of that. And that's all.
Well, to me, it brought home a little bit the need to work the Europeans into some of what we're doing, since they're French submarines and they're selling French submarines to the Indians as well. So, okay, yes, we got a microphone for you.
Thank you for coming. My name is Mitsuo Nakai, a Japan native U.S. citizen. I heard, I know part of the U.S. Marines moving to Guam. And I know Japan has donated some money and so forth. My question is how is it going? Is it could be completed sometime this year? Probably not. Maybe next year sometime? Or?
Well, Guam, the realignment with Marines moving to Guam and the Guam being built up into a real hub for our Asia-Pacific posture is not currently in my purview. I'm not working on Japan at the moment or Guam. But I'll just give you a very general answer, which is it is a long-term project. It's not going to be completed this year. It's still a lot of work to be done, but we're on track, and it's going to be good when it's completed. And we are talking to some other partners in the region about thinking about ways we can do some things together in Guam once the infrastructure is really built up.
Again, drifting away from India for a second, but on the similar question, what about the Marines and Air Force in Northern Australia? Where does that stand right now?
Well, we've been rotating Marines in Darwin. They're there right now, about 1,200. and rotating some aircraft in and out of Tyndall. There's some infrastructure that we want to work with Australia collaboratively on improving and expanding so that we will be able to support a full MAGTF, a full marine rotation of 2,500. So that's the endpoint that we want to get to, but we still have to work through some cost-sharing issues with our Australian colleagues. So we're working hard on that. But the Marines are there. They're training with their Australian counterparts. By all accounts, both sides, the training has gone exceptionally well and has been really mutually beneficial. You know, the whole point of these force posture initiatives was we spent a decade fighting shoulder to shoulder with Australia in Afghanistan and Iraq, and really built up incredible interoperability and a really high degree of training of special forces and other things. And so at least at the time, we thought these conflicts were winding down, we wanted to preserve the hard gains that we've made as an alliance, and also shift our attention a little bit more to the Asia-Pacific theater. So the idea that Marines and Air Force would be rotating in and out of Northern Australia, working in close collaboration with their counterparts, I think still makes a huge amount of sense, and it also gives us a platform to engage the region very effectively. So we're still implementing it and kind of learning lessons along the way, but we have the legal framework in place with our force posture agreement, and now we're just down to some nitty-gritty negotiations over cost sharing.
Good, thank you. Other questions did you have? Or in the back?
Thank you. Libo Liu, Voice of America. It seems to many of us that India been sending mixed message on the South China Sea position. I think, Mr. Secretary, you were saying that the Chinese seems to be making manipulating on the so-called consensus among nations that support Beijing's view on South China Sea. Yet, New Delhi has not come out and refute Beijing's assertion that India supports Beijing's position. So I'm wondering why India has not done so to publicly say, no, we have not said that, or we have not supported your view. So could you enlighten us?
Yeah, no, it's a fair question. I don't know the answer to why India hasn't publicly refuted, or I haven't even checked to make sure they haven't publicly refuted that. It's a good point, something we should ask our Indian colleagues. But I will say that actually India has not been ambiguous about its views on the principles of things like freedom of navigation and peaceful resolution of disputes according to international law, and the use of international law to resolve disputes. And we heard this most directly and forcefully from Defense Minister Parrikar in Malaysia at the ADMM Plus, where his intervention was full of the Indian view on maritime disputes, and it was completely aligned with our position, I have to say. I mean, in terms of our principles that we regularly articulate. The other thing that India is a big role model as we think about the use of international law to resolve disputes through arbitration and other legal means, because India took Bangladesh to the arbitral tribunal under UNCLOS over dispute in the Bay of Bengal, and they lost, and they completely abide by that ruling. So both the use of arbitration and the recognition that international law is binding, and if an arbitral tribunal makes a ruling, you abide by it. That is a huge positive example that we cite often, and India cites itself, and recognizes that it's playing that sort of positive role model. So I was just at the senior officials meeting for ASEAN defense ministers in Laos 2 weekends ago, and at these meetings, countries go around the table and express their views on key regional dynamics. And not everyone spoke up with a clear voice about their position on the South China Sea, but I will say that no one sided with China's position that arbitration is not valid, that China will not be bound by any arbitral ruling. No one supported it, and a large number of countries supported our position that that it is binding on the ruling, whatever the ruling is, will be binding on both parties, and that it's very important that all countries recognize the ruling and treat it as such. So I actually think there's a growing consensus on the tribunal ruling, in our direction, not in China's direction, but.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Before I let you go, I want to congratulate you. I don't know whether to congratulate you on your emancipation from government service in the near future, or your new role at CSIS, which will start up in a couple months as chair of their Southeast Asia program. So they're really lucky to have you over there.
Thank you. Yes.
I look forward to working with you in that new capacity.
Thank you very much, Walter.
Thanks again.
Thank you. Thanks.
I'd like to invite Sanjoy Joshi up to talk just a little bit. He's from our partner organization in this endeavor, Observer Research Foundation. I think he wants to share a couple thoughts with us before we move on to the panel. Please, Sanjoy.
Thank you so much, Walter, and it's always being a pleasure. It's being at the Heritage Foundation with friends like you. Well, it's very difficult to follow Amy's act. She's answered most of the questions which we would have been expected to answer, and you have a great panel discussion which is going to follow. Amy's covered, I think, the entire ground, and she's spoken with, I think, unmitigated optimism about the relationship which we are all gathered here to discuss. And there is actually a lot, going for the India-US defense cooperation, the relationship which has progressed over the last few years. And Amy has covered the ground very well, so I'm going to skip most of it. I'll go back to what Walter began with about there being both pessimism and there being optimism. The point is whether you're a pessimist or optimist, the glass is 50%. You can call it half full or half empty. It is not fully full. What I'll briefly do is try to deconstruct what it is that in the larger vision of the Indo-US defense cooperation and the larger engagement, what is it that makes the glass just 50%? We began with the signing of the new framework for defense cooperation that was in 2005. And that has actually caused a massive shift, did cause this huge shift in the India-US defense partnership, in the overall strategic relationship between the two countries. We've seen it progress from the Malabar exercise, which Amy spoke about, then Operation the Yuddha Abhyas and the Vajra and everything else which has followed. Yes, the US has also entered into big defense deals with India. Just been about $10 billion since 2007, 2008. And these deals include really big ones like for the 12 C-130J Super Hercules aircraft. Then you have the long-range maritime patrol aircraft, and so on and so forth. The DTTI launched in 2012 to navigate US limitations on sharing certain technologies, and that has made huge progress, addressed, I think, some of India's core concerns which were expressed about transfer of technology and tying up very well with the Make in India mission of Prime Minister Modi, which Amy spoke about. And then, of course, you have coming down right recently, I'll skip everything in between which Amy covered. We have 2016, last month, following Defense Secretary Carter's visit, India and the US did sign the memorandum, the LEMUA, which is one of a raft of technical agreements aimed at bringing the militaries of the two sides to the point where they can perhaps in the future operate far more seamlessly than they have been doing. And so to conclude, it is hoped that the two countries are well on the way to enter what are called various foundational agreements, and the word is used in that sense, the foundational agreements, which will operationalize India's military commitments as part of the joint strategic vision for the Asia-Pacific and the Indian Ocean, which was arrived at during President Obama's visit during 2015. So yes, there does seem a lot going for the US-India partnership. The developments actually all point in a way to operationalizing India-US maritime cooperation in the wider Asian Commons. So let us have a closer look at that commons. What does it mean? Let us try to place it in context. India's principal predicament in Asia, the principal predicament India faces in Asia, is about striking the right balance in its overall relationship with China. And that quest in many ways continues to define the boundaries of the India-US partnership. Now, India's effort to expand security cooperation with the United States underscores India's appreciation of Asia's evolving maritime architecture. The fact is that despite being the most capable maritime force in South Asia, the Indian Navy does not yet have the capacity to underwrite security in the South Asian littoral, even, I would say, with respect to rising transnational crime or, environmental degradation or various other, humanitarian measures, which it keeps getting pulled into. At the same time, the PLA Navy's growing presence and influence in the IOR region is a source of abiding concern for the Indian Navy. New Delhi feels compelled to desist from publicly voicing its anxiety. This is in spite of deepening misgivings about the composition of anti-piracy patrols in the region. Now they comprise of submarines, amphibious ships, guided missile frigates, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, you have Beijing's maritime Silk Route proposal, which many Indian observers, which if you read the Indian press, they keep on commenting that it perhaps is only a pretext for a more robust presence for the PLA Navy in the Indian Ocean. The point is, while all attention seems to be focused on China's occasional saber rattling on the South China Sea, China's long-term strategies and what seems to be evolving as we look into the future, its long-term strategies definitely seems to be pushing westward. And whether you look at the Maritime Silk Route or you look at OBOR, the OBOR for China is not only a strategic posture, it has become a necessity. It is actually a ray of hope that can, to some extent, China hopes, help to absorb the massive overcapacities which have been created in China in the last decade and a half. It is positioned as that miraculous one-stop shop that can help drive growth, that can help drive demand for Chinese steel, for Chinese cement, for Chinese capacities in infrastructure creation that have been created over the last decade and a half. So it is an ambitious but economically stressed China which sees OBOR beyond mere financing and infrastructure. To move on to larger things like trade and policy harmonization across the route of the countries which are going to be connected on the One Belt, One Road, and that has become one of the 5 pillars of the project which it keeps talking about. So given the rapid rise of China and India's own discomfort with Beijing, having the US as a security partner is useful. There's no doubt about it. China may be well ahead of India in almost all measures of what is called so-called comprehensive national power, but India still remains the only country in Asia which can offset the massive gravitational lure of China as an economic powerhouse. Now, having said that, on its part, given the huge external trade which China has, the biggest loser from any disruption in the sea passages would be China itself. And there's no doubt about it. So therefore, beyond the need to have open sea lanes in the South China Sea, India has always been extremely cautious in facing off Beijing in the area. So on the east, as far as China is concerned, while India with its million-strong army and nuclear weapons does not feel any so-called, what you may call an existential threat from China, it does need coalitions that can help maintain a secure periphery. And that periphery, the point I'm trying to make is that that periphery is actually heading westward. And there comes the dichotomy. Why the glass remains half empty or half full. For this periphery also includes the region that by providing almost everything that fuels Asia, that fuels the Asian economies, and which in a way is a continent's lifeline, which in a way is its very being. From the Indian point of view, if there is one disconnect in the relationship, it is this. On the one hand, you see, it sees overwhelming support for all its Act East ventures. Whether it is India's involvement in any action that lands it right in the South China Sea, or anything to do with the ASEAN and the Indo-Pacific. But on the other hand, it finds an extremely lukewarm response to any aspirations for a westward connect. And there lies the rub. Whether that westward connect is in Afghanistan or beyond that area. And this is in spite of the fact that from the geoeconomic, the geostrategic, and forget geoeconomics and geostrategy, from the pure demographic point of view, this is the most important external region for India. India not only sources 70% of its oil and gas from there, but a 7 million strong Indian diaspora sends $30 to $40 billion in remittances each year back home to the country, which pay for India's exports. Now, this is not the raucous, cheering Madison Gardens diaspora, which we talk about, which we think about. It is actually an extremely subterranean diaspora. It is a quiet diaspora, an invisible diaspora that lives right at the bottom of the Gulf Pyramid. And any turmoil in the Middle East can swing Indian votes in a way that no cheerleaders in Madison Gardens can. And that is a reality we need to understand. So no matter what, India must, at the very, very, very minimum, must always retain the will. It must retain the capacity. It must retain the resolve and the wherewithal to carry out the kinds of extraction operations it carried out in Kuwait in 1990, and then you saw in Yemen. It can be called upon at any time. And it is this region that more than the eastern seaboard, where the prognosis for future security and stability actually is far more optimistic. It is this region, where the problem arises. For all the drills, the joint exercises, or planning between the U.S., which is the dominant power with the fleet headquarters in Bahrain, in spite of all that, all these exercises take place where? On the eastern seaboard. It is in East Asia where India finds itself building trilateral partnerships with the US, with others like Japan, with Australia, with South Korea. In the Persian Gulf and the Saudi Peninsula, India finds itself plowing a rather lonely furrow. So the success actually of, when we start talking of the glass full rather than a glass 50%, the success of a sound India-US partnership is to clearly think through some of these issues. India needs the US, desperately needs the US as a guarantor of a secure and stable Asia and a comprehensively stable Asia. As a security provider in the Gulf region, so even as the overall tenor of the relationship, which we all admit here, the overall tenor of the relationship is extremely sound and we have growing convergence on East Asia, the time has come to focus on the gap that exists in this relationship and address some of the other vital areas which are very, very critical to India's interests. Ultimately, to conclude, all I'll say is that India and the US are going to find a lot in common and are going to find a lot of common ground in strengthening India as a military power. But eventually, in the final analysis, it'll be the emergence of a stronger and economically vibrant India alone that will best serve global interests by preserving the strategic balance in Asia. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Sanjoy. Let me invite the panel to come up. You know, I'm reminded, listening to your remarks, that maybe the solution to the U.S.-India relationship is to recognize that actually the glass is full, half air, half water. I think that'll help us maintain our sanity as we build out the relationship. But I think you offer great context for our discussion because, you know, we've been doing this quadrilateral dialogue for a number of years at Heritage with some partners in India. And the one thing that has struck me the most is that from a U.S. perspective, the strategy, the strategic picture, we largely think about as Pacific. And when we say Indo-Pacific, what we usually mean is the Pacific plus India. We don't really think very much about India's strategic interests outside of the Pacific and west, particularly west of there. And so I think it's fair for us to talk a little bit more about what may be more in India's interest than ours in the process of recruiting India's involvement and some of ours in the Pacific. So with that, let me introduce our panel, and then we'll get started. We've got about an hour for presentations and discussion. We're going to start off with Paul Kapoor. Paul is professor in the Department of National Security Affairs at the U.S. Naval Postgraduate School. He's also an affiliate at Stanford University and a visiting fellow at ORF. Previously, he was on the faculties of the U.S. Naval War College and Claremont McKenna College and was a visiting professor at Stanford. He's the author of a couple of books, one, Dangerous Deterrent, Nuclear Weapons Proliferation and Conflict in South Asia, and another where he's co-author, India, Pakistan, and the Bomb, Debating Nuclear Stability in South Asia. Dr. Kapoor received his PhD in political science from the University of Chicago. We'll turn to you in a second. Before we do, let me introduce our other panels. Richard Rossau. Rick is a frequent visitor and collaborator here at our Asian Studies Center. I don't know why we haven't had you on the stage more often, given how much
I'm a terrible speaker, that's why.
given how much we've worked together in the past. In fact, I looked it up before I came up here. I think last time you were here was before I was here, which is getting very long. You were at the U.S. India Business Council at that time. But Rick's a real authority on the U.S. India relationship, a wise man, really, that many of us rely on. He's currently a senior fellow and holds the Wadhwani Chair in U.S. India Policy at CSIS. Rick joined the CSIS in 2014, having most recently served as Director of South Asia at McClarty Associates, and from 2008 to 2012 as Head of International Government Relations at New York Life. Then we'll turn to Lisa Curtis, who I've actually worked for all those 9 years. And in fact, the last time I introduced her, I still got her introduction wrong, which was remarkable. So I'm going to try to get it right this time. But Lisa's a senior research fellow here at Heritage Foundation. She joined Heritage in 2006. Where she had just come from the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. She worked for Senator Dick Lugar in his capacity as chairman there. Prior to that, she was the senior advisor to the Assistant Secretary of State for South Asian Affairs during the Bush administration. It's really been great working with Lisa. So much of what I know about India, I know from Lisa. So I'm looking forward to hear what she has as much as anyone else this morning. So with that, let me turn it over to you, Paul, and you get us started.
Great, thank you very much. I appreciate the invitation to be here from Heritage and from ORF as well. Before starting, let me just say that I wear a number of hats. I work for the Navy, but I'm an academic, and I'm wearing my academic hat right now, so nothing that I say should be construed as representing the views of anybody else or any government agency, Navy, DOD, whatever. So in the description of this event, the organizers asked whether India was poised to provide an anchor of global security and whether the Indo-U.S. defense relationship was meeting its full potential. I don't think that either of those statements are true yet. It'll be some time before they are. But what I think is true is that India and the United States are experiencing an unprecedented level of convergence of strategic interests, and that's driving the two countries' increasingly robust defense relationship, especially in the maritime domain, which is what I'll talk about for a few minutes here. And I think this is a result of big tectonic shifts that are occurring in the international system. Demographics and economic growth patterns have made the Indian Ocean, Asia-Pacific region a hub of wealth creation. China in particular is rising rapidly. Europe and North America have seen relative decline. Unfortunately, the international system tends not to deal with power transitions very well. Rising states generally want to remake rules that have been created by leading states. Leading states often oppose this and seek to maintain and protect the status quo. And I think some of this is occurring in the Indian Ocean, Asia-Pacific region, and it's not totally clear how things will shake out. It's up for grabs to some degree. And I think there are basically two competing models here. One is what I'd call a liberal model, which emphasizes free markets and trade, open access to commons, rule of law, deliberative dispute resolution. This is the model that the United States prefers, is supported in the region since the end of the Second World War, and would like to see instantiated even further as we go forward. And the other is what I'd call a realist model, which emphasizes more the utility of force, fait accompli, non-consultative rulemaking, and coercive dispute resolution. I think that Indian leaders, as they look out at the region and observe these developments, have arrived at kind of three big conclusions. The first is that they would prefer the region to be organized according to a liberal model rather than a realist one. Secondly, they think there's a non-trivial chance that China may seek to impose a more realist view on the region. And thirdly, they realize that they cannot resist this alone. Right? The imposition of some sort of realist framework is not something they'll be able to stand up against without partners. Although, as Sanjoy said, they also recognize that they've got to balance the relationship with China, so it's not a totally one-way thing. But I think those three conclusions are quite important. And the United States, for its part, on the one hand, is the world's only global power, but its resources are finite. It can't manage everything everywhere, nor does it want to. Would rather see in this region a web of prosperous, independent states organizing themselves and pursuing their interests according to those liberal principles that I just mentioned. So the bottom line is that the two countries need each other in the emerging strategic environment. And to a considerable extent, these developments are occurring in the maritime domain. This is a region of oceans in which SLOCs, sea lanes of communication, carry not only the areas but the world's economic and industrial lifeblood. So while the U.S. India defense relationship is going to be, of course, diverse and multifaceted, naval cooperation will be especially important. Despite its importance, there will be obstacles to robust Indo-U.S. collaboration in this area. I think perhaps the biggest obstacle will be India's lack of capacity, which will impede its ability to undertake joint efforts with partners. And so one of the first things we have to do together, I would argue, is to work together to help the Indians develop capacity in a way that leverages their comparative advantages and is also mindful of the resource-constrained environment in which they operate. And I would focus on two broad areas here, one strategic and one operational. At the strategic level, Indian political leaders are going to put greater demands on the Navy as the maritime domain's importance increases. But they may not always provide clear guidance as to how the Navy is to go about meeting those demands. What assets is it going to need in the changing strategic environment? How should it employ them? Answering those questions is going to require the Navy to undertake a degree of independent thinking that it hasn't been asked to undertake in the past. And in engagement work that I've done with our Navy, the U.S. Navy and India, senior naval officers have expressed a lot of concern about this. Some of the things that we've done is to get together and talk about how the U.S. thinks about some of these problems and moves from strategy to operational requirements to procurement, right, and things like that. And I think that helping the Indians to develop that kind of analytical capacity would be useful and it would enhance their ability to act strategically, which would be valuable to joint projects. At the operational level, frankly, the Indians need more and better stuff if they're to execute the missions necessary to contribute to the emerging regional security architecture. And here I would focus on developing the ability to play actually a fairly specific sub-regional game. In my view, the Indians don't need to operate equally all over the Asia-Pacific Indian Ocean region. For example, it's less important for them to play what I would call an away game, say in the Western Pacific, which is likely to be extremely demanding given their resource limitations. That'll be less important than developing the capacity to play a more modest home game in the Indian Ocean region. And because of the Indian subcontinent's location, jutting directly down into crucial waterways, it's well positioned to pressure key slocks and choke points, potentially giving it coercive leverage during a crisis. Having the ability to reach out and touch those waterways and points would be extremely valuable. And there are a number of ways in which India can develop the capacity to do this. We've seen some of these, we talked about some of these today. One possibility that's gotten a good deal of attention is the augmentation of India's aircraft carrier capabilities. And in fact, India and the United States are engaged in discussion regarding sharing and co-development of aircraft carrier technology, including cutting-edge systems like EMALS, the electromagnetic catapult system. This is something, by the way, that would have not been possible, I think, just a few years ago, right? When it came up a few years ago, the response from the U.S. side was, forget it. Now it's happening, so a lot of progress there. And further progress along those lines would certainly increase India's strategic reach, enabling it to stretch its air capacity well beyond its home waters. And this would also be an extremely potent symbol of U.S. India cooperation. That political signal that it would send and the momentum that it would generate would be valuable. I think there are challenges and downsides here, though, as well. Aircraft carrier cooperation is a major undertaking. It requires a lot of political heavy lifting on both sides, although, again, I think we're making some headway on that now. Also, one could argue that if India's comparative advantage lies in playing that home game that I just mentioned, significantly increasing the reach of its air power may not be the most critical task that it faces. Also, aircraft carriers are a big target, especially in an age of sophisticated anti-ship capabilities, and this will increase the risk of a major loss. And they'll also require a great deal of expensive infrastructure and support, both in port and underway. Those aren't arguments against it, but I think those are things to think about as we consider further cooperation on this, and also think about how realistic it is to happen or to come to fruition in the short term. A couple of possibilities that I like are actually a little bit lower in profile, but I think could actually be useful for that home interdiction role that I just mentioned, and would maybe be a little bit more doable in the near future. One is helping India to develop naval infrastructure, especially in places like the Andaman and the Nicobar Islands, which are even more forward deployed than the Indian subcontinent itself. This would enable, or enhance rather, India's ability to station assets quite far forward, and it would help with everything from maritime domain awareness to actively pressuring slocks and choke points. It's scalable. So projects could range from pretty small, mundane stuff, building housing infrastructure, all the way to runways, to improving and installing ISR capabilities, you name it. And that could be scaled according to the comfort of the two parties and what was required at the time. It's not overly provocative. You could do it with relatively little fanfare, and that lessens security dilemma concerns. Another possibility that I like is the augmentation of India's submarine capabilities. We tend to think of submarines playing a nuclear deterrent role, which of course they do, but they can also play an important role in the interdiction of sea lanes. And in India's case, their firepower, stealth, and relative independence, and lower cost also, could help to bolster India's ability to play the home game without some of the problems associated with very resource-intensive, high-profile capabilities like aircraft carriers. So helping India to develop a robust attack submarine capability would be useful. Here, there are obviously obstacles too. The United States isn't prepared to share nuclear submarine technology, and India also has a long and close relationship working with Russia on submarines. But I think within limits, the United States could do other things, like offering technical criticism and advice, and helping to develop operational expertise. It's worth noting that the Indians haven't been terribly happy with a lot of the high-end stuff that they've gotten from the Russians, and in fact, their new diesel submarines are going to be Scorpions. And I think it's not a coincidence then that you're seeing some movement between the United States and India on the submarine front, with cooperation on anti-submarine warfare and also on submarine safety, which could probably be given a broad interpretation to cover a wide range of operational matters. And I think that could be another fruitful area for maritime cooperation between the two countries. Obviously, those aren't the only things we can do. There are many others, but there are things that I think would be particularly useful at this juncture, and I try to give you a sense of kind of what the logic behind that, again, playing that sub-regional game. And I think would help to enable India to play a robust role in building a stable and prosperous security architecture for the region. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
That's true. Thank you. Great.
Well, I guess so far you've heard the positive, cheery pictures about what we're doing and what we think we're going to be able to do in the future. I've been getting the task about talking about the private sector's views, and unfortunately I think the private sector views of defense partnership is lagging a little bit behind. It's a little bit interesting if you look at our economic engagement and our security engagement since Prime Minister Modi took office. You know, I think on the economic engagement, you've got a lot of business deals taking place, a lot of investors going, trade deals, but at the highest levels, there's a huge divide between our positions on global trade and economic issues. India is our chief opponent at the World Trade Organization. We're not part of the same trade blocs that are being developed right now. And even our own attempts to negotiate an investment treaty are further away than they were 8 years ago when we announced our intention to do so. On the security side, though, at the highest levels of our administrations, we've done tremendous work in the last 2 years. The Joint Strategic Vision that Amy mentioned, renewing the Defense Framework Agreement, such powerful things that have been done, announcing DTTI programs. But the private sector, I think, in our defense industry is still lagging behind a little bit. Now, they've had some success, right? I mean, now versus 15 years ago, we've got north of $10 billion in U.S. defense deals, closer to $15 billion now. But that's really, you know, it's a small number of systems. If you were to take 10 fingers and grab, 10 deals, almost all that amount would be taken off the table there. So I think probably some part of it is that, American companies still aren't winning the day-to-day bids that are out there so far. So we've got a good book of business. People talk about that number a lot, but it really boils down to a couple of very large programs that that the American contractors managed to win: the C-17, C-130J, the Apache, the Chinook, the P-8, a few others. So the number itself, I think, kind of tricks us into thinking that the private sector should be a little bit more bullish right now, but so far they're a bit behind. I'm not saying they should be, and in fact, the line that I came up with the other day that I like to use now, you probably heard me do a few more speeches in the future too, is you think about defense partnership as a cross-country drive from New York to California, and at some point during that drive, you're going to have a speed limit of 70, and sometimes you're going to have a speed limit of 35. And what I tell private defense companies right now, the speed limit is 70, and most of you are still driving at 35. Now is the time. You should be meeting with government, engaging heavily, talking about the kinds of things that you need to see shaped to make the business environment for yourselves better, pressing deals, lobbying here in the United States. But they feel burned and disappointed by past experience. And so even though the speed limit is 70 now, they're still driving at 35. And hopefully that can change as we've got such great high-level engagements happening right now. So I'll roll back some of the reasons and why I think the thinking is where it is right now, and then I'll talk about some of the reasons why I think there should be a bit of a brighter horizon for private companies, at least some of the opportunities. So if you look back, and I first began my journey with India in 1998 just on the heels of the nuclear tests, and military ties were essentially cut off. There wasn't any trade to speak of. A few years later, we had our first deal, Raytheon, with the Firefinder radar system, but still, 15 years ago, it was still extremely nascent. With the announcement of our intention to share civilian nuclear technology when Prime Minister Singh came to Washington in the summer of 2005, I saw such energy by the U.S. defense establishment. We at the U.S. India Business Council were deeply active in leading the lobbying efforts on behalf of companies that wanted to see civilian nuclear trade. And American defense contractors, there was more of them showing up for our meetings than there were nuclear companies. The perception was, if we help India achieve its most substantial at the time strategic objective in engaging the United States, civilian nuclear trade, that every defense deal that we could possibly imagine and hope for would flow from that, including, of course, the medium multi-role combat aircraft bid that was I don't remember exactly how far along it was in 2005, but within a short period of time, I think people had kind of crystallized that was a great target for us. So the defense companies that were as active on the nuclear agreement, every engagement the U.S. India Business Council was hosting at that time, no matter who it was. If it was the Secretary of Water Resources from Kerala, they would show up in force and talk about the importance of America as a defense and strategic partner to India. I think expectations for that on both fronts were unmet. On the nuclear cooperation, with the passage of a liability law that so far American contractors haven't felt would accommodate their interest. And then the fact that the two platforms we put forward in MMRCA weren't taken forward to the final round. So I think on both fronts, the companies that had really kind of put their shoulder to the wheel, got their executives out, spent money, and really did a lot of things they thought would achieve their objectives, that was kind of unmet. So that was their first opportunity, I think, for the private sector to really kind of show their commitment to shoring up the security partnership. Also, our systems for how we sell and how India buys still aren't a perfect match, and the work that Secretary Carter and the team are doing are helping for both sides, I think, to better understand that. But it's puzzling, and India changes the system once in a while. They change personnel, which makes a difference. And so, the systems, it's a real technical thing that makes it sort of difficult, the process that India wants to go through versus ours. It gets overlooked sometimes, and people think that's just kind of an excuse, but it is two very different systems and difficult to bridge the divide. Another frustration that I think American companies voice is, for instance, sometimes even when they're told that they're going to choose an American platform for a bid that's out, it can still take a couple of years sometimes to take that to fruition, or sometimes it'll get canceled even after it's been indicated that they'll be chosen. So how often can you get your company's executives sort of riled up? India's next opportunity, it's the next billion-dollar market for us, and only to see deals taken off the table, multiple times. And even with Apache and Chinook, the companies it was indicated to them multiple times over a couple of years that the deal was finalized, it was going to happen, and still took 2 or 3 years before they understood that the decision had been made to go with those two platforms. Before they actually began contract talks. So, this again just kind of aids the fact that right now you've got leadership within the defense establishment ready to do exciting, incredible things, but the private sector, now that they probably can do a bit more, they just don't feel the energy because of these past experiences. Also, domestically, you've got foreign equity restriction that limits, particularly for the suppliers to America's major defense contractors. You got foreign equity cap, which has been lifted to 49%. The opportunity to go to above 49% on a case-by-case basis, but for a company to develop a business plan based on one line that says we'll allow above 49% if you bring new and interesting technology, it's not really enough for a defense major to go back and sell their team on a business plan to pitch to the government of India. So that toehold to allow above 49% hasn't been the thing, I think, that's brought in the flood of foreign investments that the government of India had hoped for when they increased it. So discharging offsets as well, the policy continues to change and shift, and it's a bit more restrictive than what companies find in a lot of other countries. Although I think every iteration, including the one that was just released, you see certain relaxations generally. Multiplier effects if you go with small and medium companies as your discharge partners for offsets, allowing some things that are more along the lines of indirect offsets as time goes on. So there again, I think you see as each iteration of the defense procurement policy come out, it provides a bit more scope, but still it isn't quite as open and easy, I think, as companies would like right now. But that gets back to the point. I mean, if defense contractors today feel that the rules aren't exactly fitting for the business model they'd like to employ in India, there's no better time that I've ever seen to engage the government directly and try to shape that. But when they're not ready to deploy their CEOs on a regular basis, with Prime Minister and his top leaders, you just don't have as much opportunity, I think, to kind of shape the rules as it moves along. The last thing I'll mention too is the partners for discharging offsets in India. There's a small number of companies, I think, that queued up pretty early in line to say that we will be your partners, and it's the traditional major business houses in India that we're all used to doing business with over time. A lot more interesting things are being done on security innovation by smaller firms right now, which frankly American firms have had some level of difficulty actually trying to locate and helping them to scale up. So I think the folks that are ready for technology transfer, that are ready to do deeper engagement on defense material production in India, there's budding entrepreneurs coming up now. You've seen the Modi government actually make, its first major business reform it did after it stepped into office was delicensing most defense production to the private sector. About 60% of defense production was delicensed to the private sector. They've increased the foreign equity cap. They've extended industrial licenses for the private sector. And the defense procurement policy, as I mentioned, it includes a multiplier if you choose small and medium businesses. And it also gives right of first refusal for small RFPs to the small and medium sector in India. So you see some things right now that hopefully some of these smaller mover and shakers in the defense industry in India that needed a bit of assistance to get a leg up, that could be viable partners for American contractors as offset discharge partners. You see some things moving right now that I think the environment is steadily getting a bit better. But again, not every company that should be looking right now is looking because of these past experiences. So I think long term, it's a long road, as I mentioned. Right now, companies can move a lot faster, but I don't think they're engaging as robustly as they did 10 or 15 years ago. And it's probably in their interest to do so, both because you might have a greater opportunity to get deals now that the lens is swinging back towards the United States. But you can't make promises on that because that was the assumption they came in on at the heels of the nuclear agreement. But more importantly, if they feel that the environment needs to be shaped, now is the best time we've seen in India's independent history. And we don't know if we're going to have a leadership team that's going to be more leaning towards the United States as a strategic partner than we've got right now. So what is a better time to do it? I don't expect that future governments, if the BJP's out, are going to make the business environment for defense ties worse, but they may not make it better as rapidly as this government would. So the time to engage, I think, is right now. If the environment's not perfect, you got to hit the wall and do it. So a bit of a call out, I think, to defense contractors to pick up their end of the bargain and support the great work that's being done from leadership. Looking ahead, what are some things that I think could tilt the balance and make American firms a bit more interested and excited or open up opportunities? I think there's a realistic chance that you might see further relaxation in the foreign equity restrictions to go above 49%, to articulate more clearly when above 49% would be allowed. The fact that few companies, I've heard there's only been 1 or 2 applications so far to go above 49% under the current regime. That's the biggest signal to a pro-investment government that they need to go back at the regulations. I think there's an article in the defense procurement policy that has not been issued yet, which talks about strategic partners and any additional weightage that might be given to a strategic partner as bids come out. Hopefully the great work that Amy's doing would mean that America would be considered, given some kind of a preference above the minimum price for some offers occasionally. Those that have looked really closely at the 2005 versus 2015 Defense Framework Agreement, a lot of it looks roughly similar, but there's some important additions, and one of which is pregnant with possibilities, you might say. Exchange experiences and practices operating common platforms. So for a lot of American defense contractors, this notion about common platforms can be very exciting. But again, not everybody's necessarily digging into the weeds on these kind of things. But it shows, I'm sure due to a lot of hard work and sweat on Amy's behalf, but the fact that it's part of the new framework agreement, that we look at common platforms. It's an exciting proposal, and also talks about a bit more of a lean towards the United States as maybe a preferred partner if we can bring that section to life of the framework agreement. So lots of things underway right now that I think could open up the scope, and hopefully, again, the great work that's being done by our policy leadership would attract and interest the private sector. But I just don't see them joining in the clapping exercise right now as we take things forward. But hopefully, a few of these changes will make that happen. So I'll leave it there and have to take questions after.
Thank you. Great. Lisa.
Great. I'll try to keep my remarks brief and give a political geostrategic context to what we've already heard. U.S. officials have long been interested in seeing India play a larger role in Asia and being part of the U.S.-Asia pivot strategy. But the previous Manmohan Singh government was very cautious in responding to the U.S. overtures and seemed somewhat conflicted about its strategy to deal with the rising China. The Modi government, in contrast, has been much more receptive to Washington's overtures, even as the Modi government seeks stronger economic and business ties with China. And you can see several concrete examples of this. For starters, it looks like Modi will be visiting the U.S. for the 4th time in 2 years, coming up shortly. The fact that he invited President Obama to be the chief guest at the Republic Day parade, the first time ever a U.S. president has been given such an honor. The signing of the Joint Strategic Vision, which we heard about from Amy earlier. The Defense Trade and Technology Initiative, which we heard about from Rick. You know, all of these things demonstrate in very concrete terms a greater receptivity toward Washington's overtures and interest in seeing the two countries cooperate together in Asia more broadly. Now, we heard about the maritime element, which is a very important part of the defense cooperation. And here I just want to say that when Ash Carter was first named as Defense Secretary, there was a lot of excitement in India and the thought that, okay, here's somebody who started the DTTI when he was Deputy Secretary of Defense, and there was a lot of optimism that the defense relationship would move forward under his leadership. And I think we have to say that he has lived up to these expectations. I think we have seen a great commitment from the Defense Secretary in improving this relationship. And he's had a partner in Defense Minister Parrikar. The two have met 4 times in just the last year, which I think shows just how much this defense relationship has improved under his leadership. So a potentially significant step in improving Indo-U.S. strategic and defense ties was the introduction in late March of legislation, the U.S. India Defense Technology and Partnership Act, which was introduced by Representative George Holding. And in this legislation, it lays out very specific steps for enhancing defense ties, including designating a point person to coordinate the interagency policy process regarding defense trade and technology transfers to India, facilitating the transfer of advanced technology for combined military planning with the Indian military on humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, counter-piracy, maritime domain awareness, as well as coordinating with India on contingency planning on mutual security threats. And lastly, but perhaps the most significant part of the legislation, is a proposal to amend the Arms Export Control Act to streamline the export control and arms notification process for India, basically putting it on par with NATO countries and other key U.S. military allies. So this is quite interesting legislation. We'll have to see where it goes, but I think it shows the strong bipartisan support on Capitol Hill for improving the U.S.-India relationship. Now, some strategists may be skeptical of the idea of treating India on par with our NATO partners or treaty allies, and this derives primarily from India's continued close defense partnership with Russia and concerns about technology control. But I think Washington also has to factor in the evolving security situation with regard to China and the need for countries like India to play a larger role in helping maintain the balance of power in Asia and to continue to ensure freedom of the seaways. And to fulfill this role, India needs adequate defense capabilities and access to advanced military technology. And while, of course, some of this technology can be obtained from countries like France and Israel, it's in the U.S. interest to also be a key supplier for India and to solidify that strategic relationship. So let me now talk about some of the obstacles to deepening the U.S.-India defense and strategic partnership. The first one is Pakistan. And I think, we saw in recent months a jolt to the U.S.-India relationship when the Obama administration announced that they would be transferring U.S. F-16s, additional, I think, 8 F-16s to Pakistan. And immediately following this announcement, the Indian Foreign Secretary summoned the U.S. ambassador to register India's objections. And of course, India is concerned that the F-16s would be used in the event of conflict between India and Pakistan. And thus, they see the sale as impacting the overall strategic balance in the region. Now, the Obama administration, on the other hand, argues that Pakistan uses the F-16s in its counterterrorism operations in the tribal border areas, and that America's control over the training and spare parts that are necessary to operate the aircraft provides the U.S. a degree of leverage in how they are employed. Now, the second irritant revolves around China and its westward focus. India is concerned that the U.S. is warmly welcoming China's role in an Afghan reconciliation process. India is also concerned about Chinese plans to increase its infrastructure investment and development in Pakistan through the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. We were just in India in February, and we heard a lot about this from our interlocutors, India's concern about the CPEC. So in India's view, China will collaborate with Pakistan in Afghanistan to the detriment of India's interests. And they argue that if the U.S. wants India to play a larger role in the Asia-Pacific, it must also help protect New Delhi's security interests along its western border, which includes denying China a larger foothold in that region. From the U.S. perspective, they believe that an enhanced Chinese role in Afghanistan could help stabilize the region. And they say that China's interest in curbing the influence of Islamist extremists in this region will encourage the Chinese to pressure Pakistan to crack down on terrorists. So you have fundamental different viewpoints on China's increasing role westward that we heard about from Sunjoy earlier. So I lay those two issues out there as sort of cautions to all the good stuff we're talking about and forward movement, because I think they do have an impact on the pace and scope of the U.S.-India defense partnership. So just to conclude, I think the U.S. should definitely take advantage of opportunities to deepen the defense partnership with India, should provide those advanced naval technologies so that India can maintain an edge in dominating its own Indian Ocean region, and also keep looking for those opportunities to strengthen the trilateral cooperation that we have between the U.S., India, and Japan, and finding ways to bring Australia into that cooperation. Maybe you don't have the capital Q Quad that there seems to be some reluctance to engage in, but you can certainly find specific opportunities, operational opportunities, to have the four countries cooperate. But I think at the same time, the U.S. has to keep its expectations realistic. It needs to recognize that Indian strategists see that they are behind China with regard to military capabilities, economic strength, and they're going to have to balance their desire to show Beijing that they have maritime options with the need to also maintain peaceful relations with China and avoid any hostilities along their disputed borders. And with regard to Pakistan, I think the U.S. must demonstrate that it can pursue separate relationships with both countries simultaneously, but without harming India's core national security interests. Of course, with Pakistan, the U.S. requires counterterrorism cooperation, Pakistan's cooperation in stabilizing Afghanistan, and for Pakistan's nuclear weapons to remain safe and secure and out of the hands of terrorists. With India, the U.S. has much broader security goals in terms of seeing India play a more robust role in providing stability in the Indo-Pacific region. So the trick is to keep those very separate goals with each country on their own tracks and not to allow one country to influence the other, except for making the point that the U.S. does need to pay more attention to India's core national security concerns, coming back to a point that Walter raised earlier. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Lisa. I wanted to start off by focusing a little bit on the
air part of the glass. You know, if it's half air, half water, how much of it is air? And maybe a little critical view, because you know, I talked a little bit about Sanjay's remarks and the sort of strategic views we have and where they may differ, and what the U.S. can do to better accommodate India's strategic interests that may not be immediately our priority. But the one part, and it's not anything against you, Sanjay, because I hear it in a lot of comments on the Indian side, but this idea that the United States helps itself by helping India. So what the United States is getting out of this relationship is that you're helping us. And the stronger we are, the better for you. And what a great position to be in as you know, in a relationship, is that you know, what we get out of this is just making you happy. And so I understand the big strategic picture, but I think if you really look at it, the U.S. is making a big bet on some theoretical possibilities. That is, that there is this big geopolitical thing going out there, and India is going to be on our side. And so we're very sensitive to things like this statement that came out, the communique on South China Sea, because maybe we're doing all this and we're helping India, and yet they're not going to be with us in the end. So I just would like to hear from the panelists, are there more immediate, more transactional benefits to the United States? You know, the Indians got the nuclear deal. They've declined to make the use of that so far, but they get American technology. They get weapons. They get a lot of things from the United States, training, et cetera, tangible things out of the relationship. So in addition to the big strategic picture, what does the U.S. get out of this relationship on the defense side that is most tangible? Paul, you want to start?
Okay, sure. You know, it's funny. When I'm in India and I speak to my Indian colleagues, they say exactly the same thing. How do we know that you're going to be with us in the end, right? So it's this, you know, that kind of that, and the interesting thing about the mistrust from the Indian side. Traditionally, the mistrust was, well, you guys are bullies and you're going to throw your weight around the region and you know, kind of push us around, and can we trust you not to do that, right? Not to be some sort of neo-colonial power. Now the mistrust is, if we jump on board with you, can we be sure you're going to be here? Are you really going to stand up to China? Do you really mean it, right? It's a totally different, it's mistrust, but it's a completely different mistrust, right? You know, the Indians worry about that too, and for them there's a lot at stake here, because it's not just, I don't think they see it as just, you know, they get a lot of free stuff. They're taking a chance, right? Because if they sign up to this project in a public way, which you know they'll have to do, they risk antagonizing China. They'd like to avoid doing that as much as they can, but to some degree it will happen. And then what if the United States changes its mind and decides, you know, hey, we're packing up and going home, and we're not in this business anymore, or we're in the business but much less robustly than we were before, and then they have to deal with and antagonize China kind of by themselves. So there are worries there, and I don't think it's a one-way street in terms of sort of just giving them stuff and it's all the benefits to them. I think there's a strong geostrategic argument, which you didn't want to emphasize, but I think it's really important. I mean, I think that a strong, you know, if you think about what our interests are in the region, we don't want the region dominated by a single hegemon that is able to impose this kind of a realist model that I mentioned earlier. A strong India, no matter what, even if we disagree on 100 things, necessarily means that's not going to be true. So that's, I mean, I think that's the strategic argument that I think really matters a lot. And of course, when we sell them things, we make money on that too. So it's also not like we're giving it to them for free,
Yeah.
right? So.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I would point here, there's a very interesting article by James Holmes up at the Naval War College, which just came out, I think, 1 or 2 days ago in Foreign Policy magazine. And he emphasizes that the U.S. must exercise diplomatic patience, I think is a phrase he uses, in dealing with India, and recognize some of the constraints, both domestic political constraints, you know, hangover from the Cold War and things that happened, you know, going back to 1971 when the U.S. sent a carrier to the Bay of Bengal, and being, you know, cognizant of that, but also the fact that India is still behind China, and they have considerations that they are taking, and there's certain risks involved in what they do with the U.S. So I think I would hold to that view that it does serve the U.S. to be patient and sort of understand the Indian viewpoint, because we do need democratic friends in Asia. I mean, India, the largest democracy in the world, that counts for a lot in terms of the direction that we want to see Asia going, the fact that we want to see democratic systems prevailing in the region, and that we don't want one nation to be able to dominate the direction of things. And I think, it requires a little bit of faith. And we have to say, look at how far we've come so far. We haven't agreed on everything, but by and large, I think the relationship has helped the U.S. in terms of achieving our overall goals in the Asia Pacific. So I think it does require a certain amount of faith on both countries' part.
Let me offer something a little more tangible on this too.
Okay,
Like,
perfect.
here's exactly how I try to articulate this when I think about where this is going and what it means credibly. And the first is a little bit tough to measure, but it is relatively tangible. In 20 years, that China has to worry about India's reaction if they do something terribly belligerent with one of their other neighbors. In 20 years, that China would at least have to consider for 3 seconds what India's reaction or opinion is going to be to that. Because right now, I don't know that that's a big consideration. That, to me, is a great place to be in 20 years. For India, what I think, and I'd be interested in others on this too, Samir and Sanjoy, a couple of years ago, Chinese troops camp out in the disputed border. They're not supposed to camp out, and sat there for 3 weeks. I think India tangibly would love if an American official would pick up the phone and put pressure on China to stop that, because India had very few tools to discharge those folks. Nothing that wouldn't, result in some kind of reaction that could, fall out of control. That to me is like a tangible reaction. For China to consider India's opinion if they were to consider a belligerent action, for India to know that the United States would pick up the phone when something happens and help them out to some extent. That to me is like a good encapsulation of what I'd like to see, 15, 20 years out, or sooner probably.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's still not very much tangible in in any of those responses. But I mean, I understand the picture. I mean, I'm a big supporter of closer U.S.-India relations for all the big strategic reasons. It just seems like along the way, we ought to have a little bit of payoff on the U.S. side to keep us engaged, because as much faith as we may have.
Well,
we
here's
need a
one,
little
and
bit to keep your
Amy
faith.
knows as well, but a little while before the Nepal earthquake, I understand that India's ambassador in Nepal called the U.S. ambassador and said, let's do a tabletop on if there's an earthquake in Nepal. And I think there was still some team members in Nepal, I'd heard that, when the earthquake actually happened. There you go. I mean, when you talk about like what are the biggest problem areas I see in the future between the United States and India, South Asia, both of us. Are we going to cede ground to India on issues related to South Asia, or are they going to cede to us? The fact that India has actually reached out to us to cooperate proactively. Before, it had always been us kind of. So that, like, tangible in two ways, like them reaching out and viewing us as a strong enough partner, where they'll invite us in for conversations about South Asia. And then uber tangible, tabletop on earthquake in Nepal just before the earthquake happened, and folks still there. So like, there you go. That's like, that to me is like the exciting stuff that's happening under the radar that not everybody knows.
Yeah.
I would also point to the trilateral, the U.S., India, Japan. I mean, that's increased our leverage in Asia. We want to continue to have diplomatic options in Asia, and I think that's a very tangible thing that the U.S. has been able to achieve and gets out of the relationship with India. It expands our diplomatic options.
Yeah, and I think for many reasons, you can consider the U.S.-Japan alliance as one thing, sort of anything that's to the benefit of Japan. Most things in terms of security and defense cooperation is to the benefit of the United States. So, yeah, Samir.
So let me just quickly come in.
We got a microphone for you.
Sorry. And I know Walter once introduced me as someone who makes English sound like a foreign language.
Just so darn fast is the problem.
No, so I think 3 points. I think one is what Lisa mentioned, that have patience. And I don't think you really need to look too far to develop that kind of patience. You have to only look at your own Congress to understand policy making is difficult. So every time you think India is being difficult, just go to Capitol Hill and you'll understand why decision making and law making takes time. And that's the reality of all democracies today. We are struggling with finding ways to respond very quickly to the fast changing dynamics around us. And I think that's true for all of us. That's number one. The second point is, I think to Rick's proposition, if in 10 or 20 years, and I think it's not going to be 20 years, Rick, if you just do the math, if we've doubled our GDP in the last 7 years, by 2030 you're talking to an $8 trillion GDP, which means $160 billion of defense spending at the current percentage of GDP spend. So if India is spending $160 billion on defense in 2030, I don't think you need to make that phone call. So I think that's tangible. $160 billion on defense spending in 2030 is something that the US must see as a tangible outcome of this current partnership. And the third, and I think, Walter, you don't have to be despondent. Let's remove the faith argument that Lisa puts on the table. Assuming even you have no faith, do you have any other option? So my point is, even if you have no faith, what are the other options for you today? And what are the other options for us? And I think that's the point Mr. Joshi was trying to make, that we need this partnership. And it's not because we love you. I mean, we love Donald Trump, but we don't necessarily love all of you, right? So we still need this partnership. And I think that's something that both of us have realized over the last 7 to 8 years, that we will have our idiosyncrasies, we will have our own stubbornness and our own quirks, but at the core, a liberal international order, as crafted by the US and as maybe inherited by India in this region, is in both of our fundamental interests.
On the point of patience, too, I used this line the other night, but only one person in this room heard it. 15 years ago, we thought we'd be further than we are today on defense relations. And 3 years ago, we couldn't have imagined we'd be this far. So the idea about patience, it changes over time. I mean, sometimes you can run as fast as you can run, and right now we're sort of in that. And in 3 years, maybe not. So run when you can.
Yeah, that's a fair point. Other questions? Oh, yeah.
David Hammond, Soft Power Solutions, sorry. Quick question for Paul. Paul, you did mention the nuclear weapons thing. It's kind of your gig for years. Not sure
trying to get out of nuclear weapons.
where you are. Yeah, everybody in this town's sadly trying to get out of it, but yeah, there they are.
No, I still do it.
So yeah, if you could just comment on where we are with our sort of relationship with how we engage on the nuclear weapons side, and then for Rick, the question of at one point when I was working for the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, we used to have track twos every year. And one year, I think it was 2010, I believe, it came up on the Indian side on this question of investing with some of our defense-related industries infrastructure in India itself, so we create jobs. You know, they're not, at the time, they were kind of looking at the high-tech frontier, but then scratch the surface a bit, and anything could go. I mean, you could do some pretty nifty low-tech stuff too that would employ a lot of people, would give you a headquarters presence, flag presence, and all of that. I'm just wondering, you didn't mention that at all. Is that still something that you think is important in the defense industry itself? Are they looking to do some of that? You're not talking necessarily the Lockheeds and the big guys, Boeings, but there's a lot of mid players that would be very interested, that could do a lot of things, especially in the sort of the gray area of IT's kind of stuff that's wouldn't be difficult to get export licenses.
Well, the nuclear. It's obviously a big topic. I'll tell you're familiar with some of the track 1.5 and 2 work that we did over there, and one thing that we've been looking at recently is talking with the Indians about physical security rather than sort of the big questions about strategic stability. Right, a lot of those have been hashed out, ad nauseum. Although there are changes happening there too, especially with Pakistan and the creation of some sort of battlefield nuclear capability, which I think is quite problematic. I don't know what we're going to do about that really, and I think the Indians have sort of I think their hope is that nothing really bad happens, but there's not really a solution, right, to dealing with the Pakistanis, and the Pakistanis just have a lot of faith in nuclear weapons and have a lot of faith in a slightly unstable nuclear environment, because that generates a lot of deterrence for them, or at least that's the way they see it. But I think we were recently over in India, and we had some success talking about security and safety, and that was something that the Indians seemed more actually interested in talking about also than going round and around about the same old strategic stuff. So that could be a fruitful area, and I think there was openness to that, and it's something that would be very much in our interest, our mutual interest to get together on those issues. India can also potentially have positive influence throughout the region on some of those issues as well.
On private investment in defense manufacturing in India, I guess I talked about it, but probably more in code, so I'll be a little more clear. Nobody's winning deals fast enough, and so how do you put manufacturing capacity in a country where you're just not sure, even if they tell you you're about to win the deal, and it's still maybe 2 or 3 years before you get a contract across the door. So dealing with that kind of environment where it's so stop and go, putting manufacturing in India with an expectation that there will be deals to be won is pretty tough. Those that have won deals, there's an obligation to discharge a certain amount of offsets locally. They helped Indian companies set up manufacturing, particularly down around Hyderabad. And I haven't been, but others that have say that these facilities are fantastic. They're models. It took a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. I mean, you've got to go in and train the workers to build the thing and everything. But they're coming up. So you're getting some proof points now that it can be done. It's not easy, but it can be done. But there's a whole other conversation which is worthy of 2 or 3 more panels, which is what is India's manufacturing environment like broadly? It's not a great place for manufacturers yet. There's corners that are better than others, but for the most part, you don't have reliable access to electricity. Labor laws are difficult. Licensing by state governments, you need 35 or 40 licenses to begin production. You look at all these kind of issues that manufacturers generally have, and then you place another overlay about defense procurement or defense regulations that go on top of that, and it's still not, it's just not an easy place to manufacture in toto. So there's not like a separate regulatory environment and grid for defense manufacturers necessarily. But those things, they're slowly changing. I mean, you've got a government that's very focused on creating a competitive manufacturing environment. Probably not as many reforms at the federal level under that you'd like to see, but some states, Telangana, Andhra Pradesh, Maharashtra, Gujarat, Rajasthan, some states are trying to clear out some of the bad regulations that have precluded manufacturing. So a faster deal pipeline would give confidence. Greater foreign equity, relaxation of foreign equity restrictions would allow market access for the foreign companies to go in. And I think some of the states that are leading on business environment, like these pieces come together, and it'll be a place that companies I think are going to want to go to. The last thing I'll mention on this, it's interesting when you do talk to companies that are starting to think about manufacturing in India. The fact that deal pipeline is relatively slow and sometimes small, they talk about leveraging India as an export destination or export source almost from the get-go, which is kind of exciting, and it actually sort of flows a little bit with this Make in India campaign where they want India to be the workshop for the world. Well, if you got one client and those deals are moving kind of slow, but you're going to take a shot, you got to be thinking about exports to Thailand and exports to Singapore and places like that, whether you're making military trucks or whatever it is, a little bit earlier than maybe some other markets of that size. So it's the couple of companies that I talked to that are thinking about it, it's an interesting little add-on that I guess I hadn't sort of expected, but it makes a lot of sense when you think about it.
Thank you. Well, I think we got to leave it there. Thank you all for coming out. It was a terrific discussion.